Hey, this is Brookes. I've got some time, I've got an idea, and I've got a cup of coffee. So let's forge a character. As anyone who's been watching my videos for a while now has probably figured out, I'm not the best with names. It's a bit of a rough skill for me, which leads to me making a lot of semi-pun names and placeholder names because names are important to me, but I can't figure them out very well. Leads to things like Port the Support and things like that. But this particular name, I had to show you how it came about organically, and I did not start with this name and move forward with the art. So what I started with there was a little bird that I intended to just be a wandering character. That's kind of my default, right, when I'm developing a new character. I love that wanderer archetype. The little bird there, a little cockatiel / cockatoo-esque bird. And I thought about putting him on the back of a larger creature, first of all, one that he could sort of ride into the sunset on. And then I thought about, well, what if it was a larger bird, and that bird was a beast of burden? Well, from there, I started drawing a plow on the back of this larger bird when I realized it was a plowl. A plowl. So with that name out of the way, I started thinking about why this was. Why was one bird using another bird as a bird of burden? Oh no, it's like another pun. It's a beast of burden with an I. I'm just not realizing. This is terrible. Anyway, the idea came from observing birds at bird feeders, which my family always had growing up, along with a pet cockatiel that we had, and it's a very sad story what happened there. Maybe not that sad of a story if you're sort of anti-animal captivity. But I thought that these birds weren't just finding seeds at a bird feeder and collecting them to eat, but they were thinking ahead. They wanted to establish some sustainable farming. And so their idea was to replant these seeds via plowed fields. Because why not? What happened to the cockatiel, you may be wondering? Well, it was one of the first pets that I had growing up, and she got to be pretty old. I think she was in maybe the 6 to 8 range, 6 or 8 years old. And my grandmother at one point brought her entire cage out to the porch where she was cleaning the cage. And at one point, I think, opened the door and she left and sort of sat in a nearby tree for a while. And we never saw her again. I don't know if birds in captivity tend to return to their cage. I think we left the cage out for a while. But hopefully she's still out there 10 years later. This week's illustration is a little bit different than some other Forge a characters that I've done in the past, where I will design a character with a certain amount of utility, right, and then create an illustration for them. But these two are just meant to be this, right? They're just meant to be the illustration that's in front of you here. I don't have any further purpose for these characters. I don't have a really fleshed out lore for them besides this idea. And so there's a different approach that I take in this circumstance. One thing that I had to keep in mind was the angle that I was going to draw these guys at. You want everything that you see on the front of the owl and the cockatiel there, but you also want to be able to see the plow and figure out sort of what's happening, which means the perspective has to be sort of at a 3/4 view and a little bit from the top was my idea, so that you could see a bit of the ground and see the plow that's far behind them. There's a couple of times during this process that I will redesign or take another pass at the cockatiel character. It's honestly not the strongest character design from the standpoint of, at least for my typical sensibilities, there's too many neutral shapes, if that makes sense. A lot of medium proportions. Nothing is particularly emphasized, but a few times I kind of took the cockatiel in relationship to the owl and sized him up and down a bit, tried to make the curve that he's making in the seat there sort of the opposite of the hunch forward that the owl has. And one thing that helped a lot was changing the wings to bird claw hands. Now, how does a bird have 4 legs? Hey, maybe he's a griffin, like our alley griffin. You'll see me here switching over from the overhead view of the iPad to the direct feed from the iPad, and that's something that I do every time here because the angle that I'm looking at the screen is not conducive to accurate coloring and rendering information for me, even though it's good enough for the super dark pencil and super light background that the sketch phase has. One thing that I did ahead of this video, and I've been doing a lot recently, is something that I'll cover in my next video, which will be a character design forge video. In it will be a very special guest, and something in this video relates to that video and that special guest. Honestly, it's something that has helped me both improve my drawing skills over the course of individual illustrations, but also as a whole. So I'm really looking forward to you guys seeing that. As I'm blocking in the color shapes for the illustration here, I'm keeping in mind the fact that I always intended for this to look a little bit like a kid's book illustration, a little bit more simplified looking, and so instead of treating this as a full-on digital painting with completely accurate lighting and shading, I almost want it to be flat with just a little bit of definition to give you the right amount of information. One thing that I'm doing here is actually adding some lines over at the very end of the rendering process, and I also start out with a very soft shade. So I select a light pink, drop that over the entirety of the illustration, and then use a very soft round brush to erase away some shadow. And that's really opposite of the way that I usually do things, but after that I go back with another multiply layer that's a little bit more specific on things like ambient occlusion and separating different shapes that happen to be the same color, so that you get a little bit of volume out of them. From there I add a little bit of texture as well as some lighting. And I fixed the shoulder there of the poncho on the owl. That was something that was bothering me. I think somewhere in the sketch phase, toward the coloring phase, something got kind of lost in translation for me as I was doing it, and I ended up filling in that poncho in the wrong place. But after adding all of the shadow there, I added just a little bit of light with a color dodge layer, where I took a really light yellow and added it to areas anywhere that you needed just a little bit of extra light, all the way up to a hard specular shine, which I think was pretty much only on the cockatiel's beak. And one more thing to add to the end of this illustration here that so far looks pretty squeaky clean and slick is some grit and texture. These are farming characters working in the dirt, so I wanted some patches of dirt on them and just a little bit of grime on everything, including the plow and the ground around them. When the majority of my work is either meant for larger projects or part of a larger idea, it's kind of nice to do little one-off pieces like this. It doesn't mean that it's the end for it. You never know when something like this will work its way in to something else later on, but it's nice to kind of free yourself from multiple needs for a character and just make a little illustration. If you'd like the final high-res file for this character, I'm going to make it available to Novice Bard tier patrons over on patreon.com/bageldenizen. It's a great way to support me and the channel if you'd like to see more from me. My username is bageldenizen on Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch, and I'm making 2 new videos here on Character Design Forge every week, so subscribing on YouTube lets you know when new videos are made available. Thank you so much for watching, and have fun creating!